The concept behind the sandworms of Dune has attracted swarms of questions and speculations. The answer is that they are the mindless monster from the depths. At the same time, they are the guardians of the priceless treasure. They are both the source of treasure and the source of infinite danger. What is that except the embodiment of all the unknowns which confront questing life, questing awareness? Here is what it says in that definitive compendium, the terminology of the Imperium. Shai Hulud, sandworm of Arrakis, the old man of the desert, old father eternity, and grandfather of the desert. Significantly, this name, when referred to in a certain tone or written with capital letters, designates the earth deity of the Fremen hearth superstitions. Sandworms grow to enormous size. Specimens longer than 400 meters have been seen in the deep desert, and they live to great age unless slain by one of their fellows or drowned in water, which is poisonous to them. Most of the sand on Arrakis is credited to sandworm action. They are gigantic chemical engines, alive and driven by their own needs, converting the raw stuff of their planet by heat of friction and chemical conversion into the priceless spice melange and into oxygen. Yet, they derive from the little maker, the so-called sand trout, which is identified as the creature which sealed off their planet's water, making it into a desert. Here, then, is the sandworm of Dune as you first see it, from a position in the ornithopter, piloted by the Duke Leto, accompanied by Gurney Halleck, the young Paul Atreides, and Liet Kynes, the imperial planetologist. Paul stretched up in the seat to peer ahead, saw a rolling yellow cloud low on the desert surface, some 30 kilometers ahead. "One of your factory crawlers," Kynes said. "It's on the surface. That means it's on spice. The cloud is vented sand being expelled after the spice has been centrifugally removed. There's no other cloud quite like it." "Aircraft over it," the Duke said. "I see 2, 3, 4 spotters," Kynes said. "They are watching for worm sign." "Worm sign?" the Duke asked. "A sand wave moving toward the crawler. They'll have seismic probes on the surface, too. Worms sometimes travel too deep for the wave to show." Kynes swung his gaze around the sky. "Should be a carryall wing around, but I don't see it." "The worm always comes, eh?" Halleck asked. "Always." Paul leaned forward, touched Kynes' shoulder. "How big an area does each worm stake out?" Kynes frowned. The child kept asking adult questions. "That depends on the size of the worm." "What's the variation?" the Duke asked. "Big ones may control 300 or 400 square kilometers. Small ones—" He broke off as the Duke kicked on the jet brakes. The ship bucked as its tail pods whispered into silence. Stub wings elongated, cupped the air. The craft became a full thopter as the Duke banked it, holding the wings to a gentle beat, pointing with his left hand off to the east beyond the factory crawler. "Is that worm sign?" Where the Duke pointed, crescent dune tracks spread shadow ripples toward the horizon, and running through them as a level line stretching into the distance came an elongated mound in motion, a cresting of sand. It reminded Paul of the way a big fish disturbed the water when swimming just under the surface. "Worm," Kynes said. "Big one." The spice workers, threatened by the worm, are rescued from the factory crawler, which was working on the desert surface. And, as the ornithopter takes off, Paul, crushed into a corner beside a window, stared down at the silent machine on the sand. The worm sign had broken off about 400 meters from the crawler, and now there appeared to be turbulence in the sand around the factory. "The worm is now beneath the crawler," Kynes said. "You are about to witness a thing few have seen." Flecks of dust shadowed the sand around the crawler now. The big machine began to tip down to the right. A gigantic sand whirlpool began forming there to the right of the crawler. It moved faster and faster. Sand and dust filled the air now for hundreds of meters around. Then they saw it. A wide hole emerged from the sand. Sunlight flashed from glistening white spokes within it. The hole's diameter was at least twice the length of the crawler, Paul estimated. He watched as the machine slid into the opening in a billow of dust and sand. The hole pulled back. "Gods, what a monster," muttered a man beside Paul. Then, after treachery has marooned Paul and his mother in the moonlighted darkness of the deep desert, where the giant worms abound, a new sound began to impress itself on them. A muted whisper, a hissing, an abrasive slithering. "Worm," Paul said. It grew louder, faster. Paul gasped. The first rock shingle, like a beach slanting from the sand, lay no more than 10 meters ahead of them when they heard metal crunch and shatter behind them. Their ornithopter was gone. Paul shifted his pack to his right arm, holding it by the straps. It slapped his side as he ran. He took his mother's arm with his other hand. They scrambled onto the lifting rock, up a pebble-littered surface, through a twisted, wind-carved channel. Breath came dry and gasping in their throats. "I can't run any farther," Jessica panted. Paul stopped, pressed her into a gut of rock, turned, and looked down onto the desert. A mound in motion ran parallel to their rock island. Moonlit ripples, sand waves, a cresting burrow almost level with Paul's eyes at a distance of about a kilometer. The flattened dunes of its track curved once, a short loop crossing the patch of desert where they had abandoned their wrecked ornithopter. Where the worm had been, there was no sign of the aircraft. The burrow mound moved outward into the desert, coursed back across its own path, questing. "It's bigger than a Guild spaceship," Paul whispered. "I was told worms grew large in the deep desert, but I didn't realize how big." "Nor I," Jessica breathed. Again, the thing turned out away from the rocks, sped now with a curving track toward the horizon. They listened until the sound of its passage was lost in gentle sand stirrings around them. And yet again, as the two fugitives must cross open sand in the night, you get an even closer look at the sandworm. "We must walk without rhythm," Paul said, and he called up memory of men walking the sand, both prescient memory and real memory. "Watch how I do it," he said. "This is how Fremen walk the sand." He stepped out onto the windward face of the dune, following the curve of it, moved with a dragging pace. Jessica studied his progress for 10 steps, followed, imitating him. She saw the sense of it. They must sound like the natural shifting of sand, like the wind. But muscles protested this unnatural, broken pattern. Step, drag, drag, step, step, wait, drag, step. Time stretched out around them. The rock face ahead seemed to grow no nearer. The one behind still towered high. Lump, 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 lump. It was a drumming from the cliff behind them. "The thumper," Paul hissed. Its pounding continued, and they found difficulty avoiding the rhythm of it in their stride. Lump, 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 lump. They moved in a moonlit bowl, punctured by that hollowed thumping. Down and up through spilling dunes. Step, drag, wait, step. Across pea sand that rolled under their feet. Drag, wait, step. And all the while, their ears searched for a special hissing. The sound, when it came, started so low that their own dragging passage masked it. But it grew, louder and louder, out of the west. Lump, 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 drummed the thumper. The hissing approach spread across the night behind them. They turned their heads as they walked, saw the mound of the coursing worm. "Keep moving," Paul whispered. "Don't look back." A grating sound of fury exploded from the rock shadows they had left. It was a flailing avalanche of noise. "Keep moving," Paul repeated. He saw that they had reached an unmarked point where the two rock faces, the one ahead and the one behind, appeared equally remote. And still behind them, that whipping, frenzied tearing of rocks dominated the night. They moved on and on and on. Muscles reached a stage of mechanical aching that seemed to stretch out indefinitely, but Paul saw that the beckoning escarpment ahead of them had climbed higher. Jessica moved in a void of concentration, aware that the pressure of her will alone kept her walking. Dryness ached in her mouth, but the sounds behind drove away all hope of stopping for a sip from her stillsuit's catch pockets. Lump, lump. Renewed frenzy erupted from the distant cliff, drowning out the thumper. Silence. "Faster," Paul whispered. She nodded, knowing he did not see the gesture, but needing the action to tell herself that it was necessary to demand even more from muscles that already were being taxed to their limits. The unnatural movement. The rock face of safety ahead of them climbed into the stars, and Paul saw a plain of flat sand stretching out at the base. He stepped onto it, stumbled in his fatigue, righted himself with an involuntary outthrusting of a foot. Resonant booming shook the sand around them. Paul lurched sideways, 2 steps. Boom, boom. Drum sand, Jessica hissed. Paul recovered his balance. A sweeping glance took in the sand around them, the rock escarpment perhaps 200 meters away. Behind them he heard a hissing, like the wind, like a riptide where there was no water. Run, Jessica screamed. Paul, run! They ran. Drum sound boomed beneath their feet. Then they were out of it and into pea gravel. For a time the running was a relief to muscles that ached from unfamiliar, rhythmless use. Here was action that could be understood. Here was rhythm. But sand and gravel dragged at their feet, and the hissing approach of the worm was storm sound that grew around them. Jessica stumbled to her knees. All she could think of was the fatigue and the sound and the terror. Paul dragged her up. They ran on, hand in hand. A thin pole jutted from the sand ahead of them. They passed it, saw another. Jessica's mind failed to register on the poles until they were passed. There was another, wind-etched surface thrust up from a crack in rock. Another, rock. She felt it through her feet, the shock of unresisting surface, and gained new strength from the firmer footing. A deep crack stretched its vertical shadow upward into the cliff ahead of them. They sprinted for it, crowded into the narrow hole. Behind them, the sound of the worm's passage stopped. Jessica and Paul turned, peered out onto the desert. Where the dunes began, perhaps 50 meters away, at the foot of a rock beach, a silver-gray curve broached from the desert, sending rivers of sand and dust cascading all around it. It lifted higher, resolved into a giant questing mouth. It was a round black hole with edges glistening in the moonlight. The mouth snaked toward the narrow crack where Paul and Jessica huddled. Cinnamon yelled in their nostrils. Moonlight flashed from crystal teeth. Back and forth the great mouth wove. Paul stilled his breathing. Jessica crouched, staring. It took intense concentration of her Bene Gesserit training to put down the primal terrors, subduing a race memory fear that threatened to fill her mind. Paul felt a kind of elation. In some recent instant, he had crossed a time barrier into more unknown territory. He could sense the darkness ahead, nothing revealed to his inner eye. It was as though some step he had taken had plunged him into a well, or into the trough of a wave where the future was invisible. The landscape had undergone a profound shifting. Instead of frightening him, the sensation of time darkness forced a hyper-acceleration of his other senses. He found himself registering every available aspect of the thing that lifted from the sand there, seeking after him. Its mouth was some 80 meters in diameter. Crystal teeth with the curved shape of crysknives glinted around the rim. The bellows breath of cinnamon, subtle aldehydes, acids. The worm blotted out the moonlight as it brushed the rocks above them. A shower of small stones and sand cascaded into the narrow hiding place. Paul crowded his mother farther back. Cinnamon. The smell of it flooded across him. What has the worm to do with the spice melange, he asked himself. And he remembered Liet Kynes betraying a veiled reference to some association between worm and spice. Barum! It was like a peal of dry thunder coming from far off to their right. Again, Barum! The worm drew back onto the sand, lay there momentarily, its crystal teeth weaving moon flashes. Lump, 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 lump. Another thumper, Paul thought. Again it sounded off to their right. A shudder passed through the worm. It drew farther away into the sand. Only a mounded upper curve remained, like half a bell mouth, the curve of a tunnel rearing above the dunes. Sand rasped. The creature sank farther, retreating, turning. It became a mound of cresting sand that curved away through a saddle in the dunes. Paul stepped out of the crack, watched the sand wave recede across the waste toward that new thumper summons. Jessica followed, listening. Lump, 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 lump. Presently, the sound stopped. Later, after Paul has been adopted by the Fremen, and after he has received his new name, Muad'Dib, he must pass the ultimate sandworm test. Capture a sandworm and ride it. Paul waited on the sand outside the gigantic maker's line of approach. I must not wait like a smuggler, impatient and jittering, he reminded himself. I must be part of the desert. The thing was only minutes away now, filling the morning with the friction hissing of its passage. Its great teeth within the cavern circle of its mouth spread like some enormous flower. The spice odor from it dominated the air. Paul's still suit rode easily on his body, and he was only distantly aware of his nose plugs, of the breathing mask. Stilgar's teaching, the painstaking hours on the sand, overshadowed all else. How far outside the maker's radius must you stand in pea-sand? Stilgar had asked him. And Paul had answered correctly. 0.5 meter for every meter of the maker's diameter. Why? To avoid the vortex of its passage and still have time to run in and mount it. You've ridden the little ones, bred for the seed and the water of life, Stilgar had said. But what you'll summon for your test is a wild maker, an old man of the desert. You must have proper respect for such a one. Now the thumper's deep drumming blended with the hiss of the approaching worm. Paul breathed deeply, smelling mineral bitterness of sand even through his filters. The wild maker, the old man of the desert, loomed almost on him, its cresting front segments through a sand wave that would sweep across his knees. Come up, you lovely monster, he thought. Up, you hear me calling, come up, come up. The wave lifted his feet. Surface dust swept across him. He steadied himself, his world dominated by the passage of that sand-clouded, curving wall, that segmented cliff, the ring lines sharply defined in it. Paul lifted his hooks, sighted along them, leaned in. He felt them bite and pull. He leaped upward, planting his feet against that wall, leaning out against the clinging barbs. This was the true instant of the testing. If he had planted the hooks correctly at the leading edge of a ring segment, opening the segment, the worm would not roll down and crush him. The worm slowed. It glided across the thumper, silencing it. Slowly, it began to roll. Up, up, bringing those irritant barbs as high as possible away from the sand that threatened the soft inner lapping of its ring segment. Paul found himself riding upright atop the worm. He felt exultant, like an emperor surveying his world. He suppressed a sudden urge to cavort there, to turn the worm, to show off his mastery of such a creature. Suddenly he understood why Stilgar had warned him once about brash young men who danced and played with these monsters, doing handstands on their backs, removing both hooks and replanting them before the worm could spill them. Leaving one hook in place, Paul released the other and planted it lower down the side. When the second hook was firm and tested, he brought down the first one, thus worked his way down the side. The maker rolled, and as it rolled, it turned, coming around the sweep of flour sand where the others waited. Paul saw them come up, using their hooks to climb, but avoiding the sensitive ring edges until they were on top. They rode at last in a triple line behind him, steadied against their hooks. Stilgar moved up through the ranks, checking the positioning of Paul's hooks, glanced up at Paul's smiling face. Now, Stilgar said, and his voice was harsh, show me you know how to handle a maker. Which side are we on? Paul glanced down at the scaled ring surface on which they stood, noted the character and size of the scales, the way they grew larger off to his right, smaller to his left. Every worm, he knew, moved characteristically with one side up more frequently. As it grew older, the characteristic upside became an almost constant thing. Bottom scales grew larger, heavier, smoother. Top scales could be told by size alone on a big worm. Shifting his hooks, Paul moved to the left. He motioned flankers down to open segments along the side and keep the worm on a straight course as it rolled. When he had it turned, he motioned 2 steersmen out of the line and into positions ahead. "Hi-yo!" he shouted in the traditional call. The left side steersman opened a ring segment there. In a majestic circle, the worm turned to protect its open segment. Full around it came, and when it was headed back to the south, Paul shouted, "Gerat!" The steersman released his hook. The maker lined out in a straight course. Stilgar said, "Very good, Paul Muad'Dib. With plenty of practice, you may yet become a sand rider." Paul frowned, thinking, was I not first up? From behind him there came sudden laughter. The troop began chanting, flinging his name against the sky. Muad'Dib, 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 Muad'Dib. And far to the rear along the worm's surface, Paul heard the beat of the goaders pounding the tail segments. The worm began picking up speed. Their robes flapped in the wind. The abrasive sound of their passage increased. Paul looked back through the troop, found Cheney's face among them. He looked at her as he spoke to Stilgar. Then, I am a sand rider still? Halyam, you are a sand rider this day. Then comes that pivotal day when Paul's Fremen forces arrive on the plains of Arrakeen to battle the Emperor and the Emperor's Sardaukar troops. Paul's sister Aliyah is with the Emperor, a captive. The Emperor surged to his feet. This play has gone far enough. I will take your brother and this planet and grind them to... The room rumbled and shook around them. There came a sudden cascade of sand behind the throne where the hutment was coupled to the Emperor's ship. The abrupt flicker tightening of skin pressure told of a wide area shield being activated. I told you, Aliyah said. My brother comes. The Emperor stood in front of his throne, right hand pressed to right ear, the servo receiver there chattering its report on the situation. The Baron moved 2 steps behind Aliyah. Sardaukar were leaping to positions at the door. We will fall back into space and reform, the Emperor said. Baron, my apologies. These madmen are attacking under cover of the storm. We will show them an Emperor's wrath then. He pointed at Aliyah. Give her body to the storm. As he spoke, Aliyah fled backward, feigning terror. Let the storm have what it can take, she screamed, and she backed into the Baron's arms. I have her majesty, the Baron shouted. Shall I dispatch her now? Yee! He hurled her to the floor, clutched his left arm. I'm sorry, grandfather, Aliyah said. You've met the Atreides, Gom Jabbar. She got to her feet, dropped a dark needle from her hand. The Baron fell back. His eyes bulged as he stared at a red slash on his left palm. You... He rolled sideways in his suspensors. A sagging mass of flesh supported inches off the floor, with head lolling and mouth hanging open. These people are insane, the Emperor snarled. Quick, into the ship. We'll purge this planet of every... Something sparkled to his left. A roll of ball lightning bounced away from the wall there, crackled as it touched the metal floor. The smell of burned insulation swept through the Salamlik. The shield, one of the Sardaukar officers shouted. The outer shield is down, His words were drowned in a metallic roaring as the ship wall behind the Emperor trembled and rocked. They've shot the nose off our ship, someone called. Dust boiled through the room. Under its cover, Aliyah leaped up, ran toward the outer door. The Emperor whirled, motioned his people into an emergency door that swung open in the ship's side behind the throne. He flashed a hand signal to a Sardaukar officer leaping through the dust haze. We will make our stand here, the Emperor ordered. Another crash shook the hutment. The double doors banged open at the far side of the chamber, admitting wind-blown sand and the sound of shouting. A small black-robed figure could be seen momentarily against the light. Aliyah darting out to find a knife and, as befitted her Fremen training, to kill Harkonnen and Sardaukar wounded. House Sardaukar charged through a green-yellow haze toward the opening, weapons ready, forming an arc there to protect the Emperor's retreat. Save yourself, sire, a Sardaukar officer shouted. Into the ship! But the Emperor stood alone now on his dais, pointing toward the doors. A 40-meter section of the hutment had been blasted away there, and the Salamlik's doors opened now onto drifting sand. A dust cloud hung low over the outside world, blowing from pastel distances. Static lightning crackled from the cloud, and the spark flashes of shields being shorted out by the storm's charge could be seen through the haze. The plain surged with figures in combat, Sardaukar and leaping, gyrating, robed men who seemed to come down out of the storm. All this was as a frame for the target of the Emperor's pointing hand. Out of the sand haze came an orderly mass of flashing shapes, great rising curves with crystal spokes that resolved into the gaping mouths of sandworms, a massed wall of them, each with troops of Fremen riding to the attack. They came in a hissing wedge, robes whipping in the wind as they cut through the melee on the plain. Onward, toward the emperor's hutment they came, while the house Sardaukar stood awed, for the first time in their history, by an onslaught their minds found difficult to accept. But the figures leaping from the worm-backs were men, and the blades flashing in that ominous yellow light were a thing the Sardaukar had been trained to face. They threw themselves into combat, and it was man to man on the plain of Arakeen, while a picked Sardaukar bodyguard pressed the emperor back into the ship, sealed the door on him, and prepared to die at that door as part of his shield. Now, in Dune Messiah, you see Paul and the Sandworms becoming myth, sinking back beneath the mystical sands of the unconscious. Here is the worm song from the Dune book. O worm of many teeth, canst thou deny what has no cure? The flesh and breath which lure thee to the ground of all beginnings feed on monsters twisting in a door of fire. Thou hast no robe in all thy attire to cover intoxications of divinity or hide the burnings of desire. And then the song of the priestess, which tells of the religion arising around these mysteries. She rides the sandworm of space. She guides through all storms into the land of gentle winds. Though we sleep by the snake's den, she guards our dreaming souls. Shunning the desert heat, she hides us in a cool hollow. The gleaming of her white teeth guides us in the night. By the braids of her hair, we are lifted up to heaven. Sweet fragrance, flower-scented, surrounds us in her presence. In Children of Dune, you encounter the sandworm again, in one of the riddles of Dune collected by Hark al-Ada. Challenge. Have you seen the preacher? Response. I have seen a sandworm. Challenge. What about that sandworm? Response. It gives us the air we breathe. Challenge. Then why do we destroy its land? Response. Because Shai-Hulud, sandworm deified, orders it. And there's the quotation from the Revised Orange Catholic Bible. And I beheld another beast coming up out of the sand, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, but his mouth was fanged and fiery as the dragon, and his body shimmered and burned with great heat, while it did hiss like the serpent. Now the ecological plan for Dune begins to eliminate the sandworms. Paul's mother, Jessica, and his sister, Aaliyah, sit in royal audience to hear the plea of an old Fremen, one Gadian al-Fali, Naib, and a Fedaykin who helped bring Paul to power. Jessica forced her attention back to the old Naib. She brought her responses under control, said, "You came to see me, Gadin?" "Yes, my lady. We of the desert see terrible things happening. The little makers come out of the sand, as was foretold in the oldest prophecies. Shai-Hulud no longer can be found except in the deeps of the empty quarter. We have abandoned our friend the desert." Jessica glanced at Aaliyah, who merely motioned for Jessica to continue. Jessica looked out over the throng in the chamber, saw the shocked alertness on every face. The import of the fight between mother and daughter had not been lost on this throng, and they must wonder why the audience continued. She returned her attention to Al-Fali. "Gadin, what is this talk of little makers and the scarcity of sandworms?" "Mother of moisture," he said, using her old Fremen title, "we were warned of this in the Kitab al-Ibar. We beseech thee, let it not be forgotten that on the day Muad'Dib died, Arrakis turned by itself. We cannot abandon the desert." "Ha!" Aaliyah sneered. "The superstitious riffraff of the inner desert fear the ecological transformation. I hear you, Gadin," Jessica said. "If the worms go, the spice goes. If the spice goes, what coin do we have to buy our way?" Sounds of surprise, gasps, and startled whispers could be heard spreading across the great hall. The chamber echoed to the sound. Aaliyah shrugged. "Superstitious nonsense." Al-Fali lifted his right hand to point at Aaliyah. "I speak to the mother of moisture, not to the Koantin." Aaliyah's hands gripped the arms of her throne, but she remained seated. Al-Fali looked at Jessica. "Once it was the land where nothing grew. Now there are plants. They spread like lice upon a wound. There have been clouds and rain along the belt of Dune. Rain, my lady. O precious mother of Muad'Dib, as sleep is death's brother, so is rain on the belt of Dune. It is the death of us all." We do only what Liet Kynes and Muad'Dib himself designed for us to do, Aaliyah protested. What is all of this superstitious gabble? We revere the words of Liet Kynes, who told us, I wish to see this entire planet caught up in a net of green plants. So it will be. And what of the worms and the spice? Jessica asked. There'll always be some desert, Aaliyah said. The worms will survive. She's lying, Jessica thought. Why does she lie? Help us, Mother of Moisture, Al-Fali pleaded. The wheel of time turns. Paul's son, Leto II, stands alone on the desert to face his worm. Leto was far out on the sand when he heard the worm behind him coming to his thumper there and the dusting of spice he'd spread around the dead tigers. There was a good omen for this beginning of their plan. Worms were scarce enough in these parts most times. The worm was not essential, but it helped. There would be no need for Ghanima to explain a missing body. By this time he knew that Ghanima had worked herself into the belief that he was dead. Only a tiny isolated capsule of awareness would remain to her, a walled-off memory which could be recalled by words uttered in the ancient language shared only by the two of them in all of this universe. Sechern-Bui. If she heard those words, golden path, only then would she remember him. Until then, he was dead. Now, Leto felt truly alone. He moved with the random walk which made only those sounds natural to the desert. Nothing in his passage would tell that worm back there that human flesh moved here. It was a way of walking so deeply conditioned in him that he didn't need to think about it. The feet moved of themselves, no measurable rhythm to their pacing. Any sound his feet made could be ascribed to the wind, to gravity. No human passed here. When the worm had done its work behind him, Leto crouched behind a dune's slip face and peered back toward the attendant. Yes, he was far enough. He planted a thumper and summoned his transportation. The worm came swiftly, giving him barely enough time to position himself before it engulfed the thumper. As it passed, he went up its side on the maker hooks, opened the sensitive leading edge of a ring, and turned the mindless beast southward. It was a small worm, but strong. He could sense the strength in its twisting as it hissed across the dunes. There was a following breeze, and he felt the heat of their passage, the friction which the worm converted to the beginnings of spice within itself. As the worm moved, his mind moved. Stilgar had taken him up for his first worm journey. Leto had only to let his memory flow, and he could hear Stilgar's voice, calm, precise, full of politeness from another age. Not for Stilgar the threatening staggers of a Fremen drunk on spice liquor. Not for Stilgar the loud voice and bluster of these times. No, Stilgar had his duties. He was an instructor of royalty. In the olden times, the birds were named for their songs. Each wind had its name. A 6-click wind was called a pastasa. A 20-click wind was a kuishma. And a 100-click wind was He'inali the man-pusher. Then there was the wind of the demon in the open desert, Hulasikaliwala, the wind that eats flesh. And Leto, who'd already known these things, had nodded his gratitude at the wisdom of such instruction. But Stilgar's voice could be filled with many valuable things. There were, in olden times, certain tribes which were known to be water hunters. They were called Iduali, which meant water insects, because those people wouldn't hesitate to steal the water of another Fremen. If they caught you alone in the desert, they would not even leave you the water of your flesh. There was this place where they lived, Ch Jakurutu. That's where the other tribes banded and wiped out the Iduali. That was a long time ago, before Kynes even, in my great-great-grandfather's days, and from that day to this, no Fremen has gone to Jakurutu. It is taboo. Thus had Leto been reminded of knowledge which lay in his memory. It had been an important lesson about the workings of memory. A memory was not enough, even for one whose past was as multiform as his, unless its use was known and its value revealed to judgment. Jakurutu would have water, a wind trap, all of the attributes of a Fremen Ch, plus the value without compare that no Fremen would venture there. Many of the young would not even know such a place as Jakurutu had ever existed. Oh, they would know about Fondak, of course, but that was a smuggler place. It was a perfect place for the dead to hide, among the smugglers and among the dead of another age. Thank you, Stilgar. The worm tired before dawn. Leto slid off its side and watched it dig itself into the dunes, moving slowly in the familiar pattern of the creatures. It would go deep and sulk. And ultimately, Leto II, who must become the sandworm of Arrakis, his body sealed in a skin of little makers. Leto II faces his moment of truth. He has waited while his body has formed its new skin, and now. Enough time had passed to form the union with his body. Leto stretched flat and turned onto his face. He began to crawl, rasping the membrane against the sand. He could feel the sand distinctly, but nothing abraded his own flesh. With only a few swimming movements, he traversed 50 meters of sand. The physical reaction was a friction-induced warming sensation. The membrane no longer tried to cover his nose and mouth, but now he faced the second major step onto his golden path. His exertions had taken him beyond the Qanat, into the canyon where the trapped worm stayed. He heard it hissing toward him, attracted by his movements. Leto leaped to his feet, intending to stand and wait, but the amplified movement sent him sprawling 20 meters farther into the canyon. Controlling his reactions with terrible effort, he sat back onto his haunches, straightened. Now the sand began to swell directly in front of him, rising up in a monstrous, starlit curve. Sand opened only 2 body lengths from him. Crystal teeth flashed in the dim light. He saw the yawning mouth cavern with, far back, the ambient movement of dim flame. The overpowering redolence of the spice swept over him, but the worm had stopped. It remained in front of him as first moon lifted over the butte. The light reflected off the worm's teeth, outlining the fiery glow of chemical fires deep within the creature. So deep was the inbred Fremen fear that Leto found himself torn by a desire to flee, but his vision held him motionless, fascinated by this prolonged moment. No one had ever before stood this close to the mouth of a living worm and survived. Gently, Leto moved his right foot, met a sand ridge, and, reacting too quickly, was propelled toward the worm's mouth. He came to a stop on his knees. Still, the worm did not move. It sensed only the sand trout and would not attack the deep sand vector of its own kind. The worm would attack another worm in its territory and would come to exposed spice. Only a water barrier stopped it, and sand trout, encapsulating water, were a water barrier. Experimentally, Leto moved a hand toward that awesome mouth. The worm drew back a full meter. Confidence restored, Leto turned away from the worm and began teaching his muscles to live with their new power. Cautiously, he walked back toward the Qanat. The worm remained motionless behind him. When Leto was beyond the water barrier, he leaped with joy, went sailing 10 meters across the sand, sprawled, rolled, laughed. Light flared on the sand as the hut's door seal was breached. Sabia stood outlined in the yellow and purple glow of the lamp, staring out at him. Laughing, Leto ran back across the Qanat, stopped in front of the worm, turned, and faced her with his arms outstretched. "Look," he called, "the worm does my bidding." As she stood in frozen shock, he whirled, went racing around the worm and into the canyon. Gaining experience with his new skin, he found he could run with only the lightest flexing of muscles. It was almost effortless. When he put effort into running, he raced over the sand, with the wind burning the exposed circle of his face. At the canyon's dead end, instead of stopping, he leaped up a full 15 meters, clawed at the cliff, scrabbled, climbing like an insect, and came out on the crest above the Tanza Rift. The desert stretched before him, a vast, silvery undulance in the moonlight.